You don't belong here. You never did. Sign the papers and crawl back to whatever base you shipped in from." My future mother-in-law didn't whisper that. She announced it, standing at the head of a table set for 42 people, senators, defense contractors, old money families from Fairfax County who wore their wealth like a second skin. She said it like she was reading from a dinner menu, and every single person in that dining room heard her. "My name is Maya Reeves. I'm 28 years old. I am a staff sergeant in the United States Army." And at that moment, I was standing in the Calloway family's 6,000 square foot estate in McLean, Virginia, holding a ballpoint pen over a document that would sign away every asset I had ever earned. The room went completely still. Crystal glasses stopped moving. Silverware stopped clinking. 42 people held their breath. Before I tell you what I did next, and why the man sitting at the far end of that table nearly knocked over his chair when I did it, let me start where this story actually begins. My grandfather always said the same thing when I was growing up in Clarksville, Tennessee, right outside Fort Campbell. He'd sit on the front porch in the evenings, still wearing his old work boots even after he retired, and he'd say, "Baby girl, the people who announce what they're worth never have anything worth announcing." He was a retired warrant officer, 30 years of Army aviation maintenance. He smelled like hydraulic fluid and Old Spice and black coffee, and he had hands so rough and calloused they looked like they'd been carved from tree bark. He didn't own much. A small house with a chain-link fence and a 2003 Ford pickup that he changed the oil on himself every 3,000 miles without exception. But he had a principle I didn't fully understand until I was standing in that McLean dining room. Never show your whole hand. I followed him into the Army at 19. Not because I had no other options, I had a full academic scholarship to the University of Tennessee. I walked away from it because the Army felt like the most honest place on earth. It said exactly what it was. It didn't dress up hard things in soft language. I did 2 overseas rotations. I worked in military intelligence signals analysis, information operations, things I can summarize publicly as, I learned how to read people. I learned how to identify threats before they announced themselves. I learned to stay calm when every instinct told me to panic. When I came home at 26, I did 2 things. I started my MBA at Georgetown on the GI Bill, and I started a small data consulting firm, just me and 2 other veterans from my unit that specialized in government contract analysis. We helped smaller defense contractors navigate the federal bidding process. It wasn't glamorous, but within 18 months, we had a client roster that generated just over $4 million in annual revenue. I drove a 6-year-old Honda Civic. I wore my civilian clothes the same way I wore my uniform: functional, clean, nothing that announced anything. My grandfather's voice in my head, "Never let them see your whole hand." I met Daniel Calloway on a Tuesday afternoon in October, in the reference section of the Georgetown University Library. He was trying to reach a journal volume on a shelf he was about 6 inches too short to reach comfortably. I was walking past. I grabbed it, handed it to him, and he looked at me like I'd done something extraordinary. He had dark eyes and a slightly crooked smile, and he was wearing a blazer with a frayed left cuff. I noticed the frayed cuff specifically. It meant he wasn't thinking about the blazer. He was thinking about whatever was in that journal. He was a 3rd-year PhD student in American constitutional history, soft-spoken, genuinely curious about everything. We talked in that reference section for almost 2 hours about absolutely nothing and everything about Fort Campbell, about Tennessee, about whether primary sources were more reliable than secondary analysis. He didn't ask about my career. He didn't ask about my finances. He asked what I thought, and then he actually listened to the answer. I told him I worked in consulting. I did not elaborate. He walked me to the parking lot. He saw my 6-year-old Honda Civic with the cracked rear bumper and the Fort Campbell parking decal still stuck to the back window. He didn't react. He just said, "Is Thursday evening too soon to get coffee?" I said no. Thursday was fine. We dated for 14 months before his family became a problem. Or rather, before I understood that his family had always been a problem, and Daniel had simply hidden them from me the way you hide a structural crack behind a coat of fresh paint. The Calloways were Virginia old money. Not tech money new, not self-made old, generational, the kind that comes with a family crest framed in the front hallway and an actual Rolodex of DC power brokers. His father, Charles Calloway, had served 2 terms in the Virginia State Senate. His mother, Margaret, ran the Calloway Family Foundation, which had its name on a wing of a hospital in Arlington. His older sister, Brianna, was a corporate attorney with a firm on K Street whose clients included 3 Fortune 500 companies. I knew this going in. Daniel told me all of it, matter-of-factly, the same way he told me about his dissertation on Reconstruction-era constitutional amendments. He didn't treat it as something impressive. That was one of the things I loved about him. What he did not tell me, and what I suspect he didn't fully understand himself, was the architecture of contempt his family had quietly constructed around anyone they deemed beneath them. The first time I met Margaret Calloway was at a Sunday brunch at the McLean estate. I wore a clean white blouse and dark slacks. No uniform. I drove the Civic. She greeted me at the door in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. She shook my hand, smiled, and looked at me the same way a building inspector looks at a house they've already decided to condemn. "Daniel tells us you're in the Army," she said. "How interesting. Do you have a plan for after?" I told her I also ran a small consulting firm. She nodded slowly. "Small. Right." She said it like a period at the end of a sentence, like that one word was the whole summary. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at the centerpiece. Over the next 6 months, I made every mistake my grandfather had warned me against. I softened myself. Not all at once, gradually, the way water wears down stone. I started answering Margaret's questions about my apartment with vague, minimizing language. Small place across the river. Nothing fancy. When Brianna asked about my firm's client base, I said we were just getting started, still building. I stopped correcting their assumptions because Daniel squeezed my hand under the table every time I started to, and afterward he'd say, "Can you just let it go? They'll come around, I promise." I wore the clothes Margaret suggested when we came for dinner. I laughed at Charles's political jokes even when they made my stomach turn. I became a smaller and smaller version of myself at that table. Then came the night I walked down the wrong hallway. I'd excused myself to use the restroom during a family dinner in late January. The hallway on the second floor of the McLean estate was long and dark, lined with oil portraits of Calloway men who all shared the same jaw. I passed Margaret's home office. The door was cracked open. The light inside was on. I heard Brianna's voice first. "She has nothing, Mother. An Army paycheck and a startup that'll be dead in 2 years. This is not the trajectory we planned for Daniel." I stopped walking. I stood completely still in the hallway. Margaret's response was quieter, but the words came through with perfect clarity. "The foundation disbursements are already delayed. Charles's legal fees from the consulting firm audit are not going to disappear. We need this handled carefully." "Then we need to move before he gets any more attached," Brianna said. "She's a liability." I stood in that dark hallway for a long moment. When a threat identifies itself, you don't announce that you've heard it. You go back to the table. You pick up your fork. You eat your dinner. And you start planning. I returned to the dining room. Daniel looked up when I sat down. I smiled at him. I ate my lamb chop. I complimented Margaret on the rosemary sauce. On the drive home, Daniel held my hand over the center console. I watched the highway lights move across the windshield, and I thought about what Brianna had said. Legal fees from the consulting firm audit. I hadn't known about an audit. Daniel hadn't mentioned it. Foundation disbursements delayed. That meant the money wasn't flowing the way they'd made it look. The next morning, I called the one person I trusted completely with anything financial. My college roommate, Keisha Brown, who was now a forensic accountant with a firm that specialized in nonprofit financial compliance. "Keisha," I said, "I need you to pull everything public on the Calloway Family Foundation. IRS 990S, state filings, anything that's open record." She called me back 4 hours later. Her voice was careful. "Maya, how well do you know these people?" "Well enough," I said. "Tell me." The 990S told a story that the estate in McLean and the silk blouses and the framed family crest did not. 3 consecutive years of declining foundation assets, a 40% drop in program expenditures, a series of large administrative expense line items that a forensic accountant would describe, in careful, neutral language, as unusual. There was also a state ethics board inquiry, not yet public, but findable if you knew where to look into Charles Calloway's consulting firm, which had received payments from 2 state contractors, whose bids he had publicly supported during his Senate tenure. The Calloways were not broke, but they were bleeding quietly, strategically, in ways they were working hard to keep invisible to the world they depended on for their social standing. They didn't need my money. They didn't think I had any worth taking. They needed something else from me. A story. A narrative. A daughter-in-law from a military family, humble and grateful and easily managed, who would make Daniel look grounded and relatable as Charles quietly navigated his legal exposure. A working-class army girl on the arm of the family's golden academic son, good optics. A human prop with a security clearance and no assets they'd ever have to share. I drove home from that phone call, and I sat in my Civic in the parking garage of my apartment building for 20 minutes. Then I called my business attorney, a woman named Patricia Wells, who had helped me structure the firm's first government contracts. I told her I needed something prepared. A complete financial disclosure, all entity assets, all active government contracts, all property holdings under the firm's LLC, verified, notarized, printed on heavyweight paper. "What are you planning?" Patricia asked. "I'm going to a dinner party," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "How formal?" "Very," I said. "Make it look like a weapon." 3 weeks later, Daniel came to my apartment on a Wednesday evening. He stood in my small living room with his coat still on, holding a manila envelope the way someone holds something they know is wrong but have convinced themselves is necessary. "My mother and Brianna think we should have something in writing," he said. His eyes were on the floor. "Before the engagement dinner. Just a formality." I took the envelope. I opened it. I read it the way my intelligence training taught me to read any document, not the preamble, not the formal language at the top. Section 4, Asset Disposition. It was not a prenuptial agreement. It was a financial absorption clause. Any business assets, equity holdings, or revenue streams brought into the marriage by the second party would become subject to Callaway Family Trust management oversight. They thought they were taking nothing. They thought they were putting a leash on a stray. They had no idea what was on the other end of that leash. I closed the envelope. I set it down on the coffee table between us. "Daniel," I said quietly, "do you know what this says?" He shifted his weight. He was looking at the wall to the left of my face. "It's just a formality. It protects the family name. You don't have a huge portfolio to worry about. It won't affect you." And there it was, the confirmation I'd needed. He knew. He had read it or been told what was in it, and he had decided that his family's comfort was worth more than my dignity. I had spent 14 months softening myself for this man. I had worn the right clothes and laughed at the right moments and bitten down on my own voice so many times I'd left permanent marks. And here he was, standing in my living room, asking me to sign my company into a family trust and reassuring me it wouldn't matter because he didn't think I had anything worth protecting. "I'll bring it to the dinner," I said. My voice was completely flat. Daniel's shoulders relaxed. The tension went out of him in one exhale. "Thank you. Really, Maya, it'll make things so much easier." He left 20 minutes later. I heard his car pull out of the lot. I sat down at my kitchen table. I opened my laptop. Then I called Patricia back. "I need the full valuation report by Friday," I said. "Everything. Don't round down. I want exact figures." She called me back the following afternoon. "Maya," she said, "current assessed value of Reeves Consulting Group, LLC, including all active federal contracts, proprietary analytical software licenses, and projected forward revenue $4.7 million. I exhaled slowly. "Print it," I said. "Put it in a red folder. Send it to my office." The night of the engagement dinner, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror. Hanging on the back of my door was the dress Margaret had texted me a link to pale blush, soft fabric, the kind of dress that says, "I am grateful to be included." I left it on the hanger. I went to my closet and pulled out my Army service uniform. The short service coat, dark blue, pressed with sharp creases. My sergeant's stripes on the sleeves. My service ribbons on the chest, including the Army Commendation Medal and the NATO medal from my second rotation. My black low-quarter shoes, polished to a mirror finish. I put it on. I stood in front of the mirror. This was not a costume. This was not a performance. This was the truest version of myself that existed, the one I had been slowly folding up and tucking away for 14 months at Callaway family dinners. I picked up my grandfather's old unit coin from the dresser. He'd given it to me the day I left for basic training. I pressed it into my palm for a moment, feeling the worn edges, and then I put it in my left breast pocket, directly over my heart. I picked up the red folder from the passenger seat of my Civic, and I drove to McLean. The Callaway estate was lit from the outside, warm gold light spilling from every window. 2 valets in dark jackets were parking cars. A line of luxury SUVs and sedans curved down the circular driveway. I parked the Civic myself, at the end of the drive, between a black Escalade and a silver Mercedes. I walked up the front steps. Margaret Calloway opened the door before I could knock. She looked at my uniform, the way someone looks at a smoke detector going off during a dinner party, startled, then deeply annoyed. "Maya," she said. "We discussed the blush dress." "I know," I said. I decided against it. I walked past her into the foyer. The dining room held 42 people. I recognized the Virginia State Ethics Board Chair Charles had apparently decided that the best way to handle scrutiny was to have dinner with it. There were 2 sitting judges, 4 current state legislators, and more K Street money than I could place by face. This was not an engagement dinner. This was a political firewall, and I was the centerpiece that was supposed to look humble and pretty and grateful, while Charles Calloway quietly rebuilt his image around me. I found my seat. Daniel was already sitting down. He looked up when I arrived, and his face moved through 3 distinct expressions in 2 seconds: relief, confusion, and then a quiet kind of alarm that told me some part of him understood what was about to happen. Margaret took her position at the head of the table. The salad course came out. Conversation moved around the table in the smooth, practiced way of people who have been performing their own importance for decades. Then Margaret set down her fork. She picked up the envelope from beside her place, setting Daniel's manila envelope, the one I'd brought in my coat pocket, and she slid it down the table toward me with 2 fingers. The way you push something towards someone you don't particularly want to touch. "I think we should get the paperwork settled before dessert," she announced. To the room, to all 42 people. "Maya, we've discussed the agreement. If you'll just sign where the tabs are marked." 42 heads turned. I looked at the envelope. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at his bread plate. I looked at Brianna, sitting 3 seats down, with her K Street attorney's smile that didn't reach her eyes. I picked up the pen that Margaret had placed beside the envelope. The room held completely still. I set the pen back down. I reached into my inner coat pocket. I pulled out the red folder. I set it on the table in front of me, flat, with both hands, in complete silence. "A fair agreement requires full financial disclosure from both parties," I said. My voice was not loud. I didn't need it to be loud. The room was so quiet you could hear the candles. I opened the red folder. "Reeves Consulting Group, LLC," I said. "Active federal contracts with the Department of Defense, 3 contracts. Current combined value, $2.1 million. Proprietary analytical software licenses, current market valuation, $800,000. Projected forward revenue, next fiscal year, $1.4 million. I looked up. "Total assessed value of assets you have asked me to sign into Calloway Family Trust Management, $4.7 million. The silence was absolute. And then the Virginia State Ethics Board Chair, a silver-haired man named Gerald Moss, who had spent the last 6 months investigating Charles Calloway's consulting firm, set down his wine glass with a sound like a small gunshot and said, "I'm sorry. Did you say Department of Defense contracts?" 3 active ones, I said. Charles Calloway stood up so fast his chair scraped back a full foot across the hardwood. He was staring at the red folder with an expression I recognized from my intelligence work, the look of a person who has just realized the room they thought they controlled is actually a trap. Brianna's attorney's composure lasted approximately 4 more seconds. Then she looked at her mother, and Margaret looked at Charles, and the triangle of silent communication between them was the most honest thing the Calloway family had shown me in 14 months. "Maya." Margaret's voice was very controlled. Too controlled. The control of someone white-knuckling the edge of something. "This is a private family matter. You invited 42 people," I said, "and you announced the paperwork before the main course. This stopped being private when you made it a performance." I closed the red folder. "I'm not going to sign your agreement," I said. "And I'm not going to be managed by a family that's been quietly bleeding out its foundation reserves for 3 consecutive years, while Charles works through an ethics inquiry that Gerald," I nodded at the ethics board chair, "already knows about." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of 42 people recalculating. Charles sat back down, slowly. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at the red folder. His face was unreadable. And in that moment, I made myself do something hard. I didn't fill the silence for him. I didn't rescue him from it. I had spent 14 months rescuing Daniel Calloway from uncomfortable silences, smoothing over his family's contempt with my own dignity, making myself smaller so he didn't have to be braver. "Not tonight." "Daniel," I said, "I need you to make a decision. Right now, at this table, in front of these people. Not tomorrow. Not in the car on the way home. Right now." He raised his eyes to mine. For a moment, he just looked at me, at my uniform, at my ribbons, at the woman he had spent 14 months watching compress herself into increasingly smaller spaces for him. And I watched him understand, maybe for the first time completely, what that had cost me. He stood up. He didn't look at his mother. He didn't look at Brianna. He looked at Gerald Moss, the ethics board chair, and he said, in a voice that was quiet but entirely steady, "My father's consulting firm accepted payments from 2 state contractors. I have the documentation at home. I'll deliver it to your office on Monday morning." The sound that came out of Charles Calloway's throat was not a word. It was something older than language. Daniel picked up the red folder from the table. He handed it back to me. He held out his hand. I took it. We walked out of that dining room the same way I left every difficult room I'd ever been in, spine straight, shoulders back, eyes forward, without looking behind us to see what we'd left in ruins. The Virginia night air was cold and clean. My heels on the front steps of the Calloway estate made a sharp, clean sound on the stone. We got into my Civic. I started the engine. I pulled out of the circular drive and drove away from the warm gold light of McLean. 6 weeks later, Daniel and I were married at the Clarksville, Tennessee County Courthouse on a Thursday morning in March. No catering, no political guests, no silk blouses or crystal stemware. My 2 business partners and my grandfather's oldest Army buddy, a man named Earl, who drove 4 hours from Nashville in his best flannel shirt, stood at the back of the room as witnesses. Daniel wore his good blazer, not the one with the frayed cuff. That one I'd quietly taken to a tailor 3 months earlier, without telling him, because I wanted to, not because anyone told me to. The judge was a small woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain who pronounced us married in under 4 minutes and then told Daniel he had good taste. He squeezed my hand so hard I felt my knuckles. The Calloway situation resolved itself the way these things always do when the architecture beneath them was never sound. Charles Calloway's ethics inquiry became public 6 weeks after the dinner. The foundation's financial irregularities were flagged in a state audit that Gerald Moss's office had apparently been preparing for months. Brianna's firm quietly dropped the Calloway family as a client. The McLean estate went on the market in June. I didn't watch any of it closely. I had contracts to run and a firm to grow, and a husband who was learning, slowly and genuinely, to take up his own space instead of borrowing mine. I still have my grandfather's unit coin. I moved it from my uniform pocket to a small shadow box on the wall of my office, the corner office, with the window that looks out over the Potomac. Some mornings, when the light hits it right, I stop what I'm doing and look at it for a moment. He was right about most things, my grandfather. But especially this: the people who announce what they're worth rarely have anything worth announcing. The ones who build something real with their hands, with their time, with the parts of themselves they protect most carefully, they don't need to announce anything. They just show up. And when the moment comes, they open the folder. If you've ever been told to make yourself smaller to fit someone else's table, if you've ever bitten down on your own voice to keep the peace for someone who wasn't keeping yours, I hope this story felt familiar. In the good way. In the way that reminds you that your value was never up for their negotiation. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.